Chapter 3, the Second Amendment and the Philistine Spirit. Do you know what the Second Amendment is? It is the right to keep and to bear an arm, a gun. Does the Bible have anything to say about the Second Amendment? Well, that phrase had not been invented yet, but the Bible does have a lot to say about stripping someone of their ability to defend themselves against threats, foreign and domestic. We're going to see here in our text that the Philistines throughout the Bible represent the enemy of God's people. And they were well armed, and they were sending out raiding parties to destroy the nation of Israel. And here's the angle I want to work on this. Here's my personal premises in this chapter. Anything that seeks to destroy God's chosen people is what I call a Philistine spirit. You see, the Philistines that we read about in the Bible never really died. They just changed their names. And their names today are Al-Qaeda and Hamas and ISIS and Taliban, and because they simply exist to destroy whatever God has blessed. Now, we're going to read our text here in 1 Samuel chapter 13, and there should be a caption in your Bible that says, Israel without weapons. And this is how it reads. Raiding parties were sent out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments, and one towards Ophir, the other towards Beth Horon, and a third towards the borderland overlooking the valley facing the wilderness. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points and their mattocks and their axes and their sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plow points and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads. And on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or a spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Now, the first lesson that I want to draw out of this is that a Philistine spirit wants to strip you of your ability to defend yourself. The story starts out with these raiding parties being sent out from the Philistine camp, which was a large, well-armed group of men that came into your town blazing saddles, raid your village, plunder everything, and then ride off to the next town. And it imposes the question, how much of that does a man have to take? To get up every day and to wonder, is this the day they're going to kill me and my family? This is where a Philistine spirit really inserts itself into the text, and this is what it says. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords and spears. See, the Philistines shut down the blacksmithing trade in Israel because they were the ones that made military-grade weapons. Axes, knives, swords, shields, spears, etc. And if this were being written today, this is the way it would read. It would say, not a gunsmith could be found in all of America, otherwise God's people will make knives, bows, rifles, and pistols, and be able to defend themselves against a Philistine spirit. Now, the picture that Samuel is trying to paint here is that the Israelites were in a helpless situation, completely unable to defend themselves. And in a nutshell, whoever controlled the blacksmithing trade controlled the military. Several years ago, there was an interesting situation that transpired in international politics with George Bush the Elder. And there was a half a dozen old Russian fighter jets that came up for sale on the international market. Well, Russia was broke and looking for some quick cash, so the Pentagon stepped in and made sure that they were the highest bidder on these fighter jets. Not because they wanted them, but because they did not want them to fall into the hands of a madman. You see, the best way to stop your enemy is to strip him of all of his resources, to make sure that you are never evenly matched. See, the enemy comes at you with a sword, a spear, a shield, but he wants you to defend yourself with a club. That is how a Philistine spirit works. The second thing we get out of this text is the Philistine spirit wants to confiscate every defensive weapon that you have. Again, in our text, it says, so all of Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. Okay, key phrase, sharpened. They started by confiscating their weapons, but a Philistine spirit does not even want you to have a whetstone to sharpen your own axe. You see, it's all about control, isn't it? This is why our founding fathers told us that we had the right to keep and to bear the same defensive weapons our government would use against us if a civil war ever broke out. This is a description of the governing authorities taking away your gun, your cleaning kit, your ammo, your reloads, and we will decide what you need to defend yourself so Give us your whetstones. Now, I do not believe our government is the devil, but stripping someone of your ability to fight back is a true Philistine spirit. And we all know that most farming tools can be turned into a serious weapon if they have to be, but they're never a match for a sword, a spear, or a gun. As a matter of fact, Chinese war strategist General Sun Tzu, in his book, The Art of War, made the observation that every battle is won or lost before it's even fought. You know, all the way back in 1987, Time magazine quoted Michael Friedman, who was a Florida state representative, who said the message we are sending out to people now is we cannot protect you anymore. Get a gun and do it yourself. There's too many people in this country that refuse to acknowledge the fact that our government cannot be there to protect us 24/7. This is what happens when you let a Philistine spirit take away your sword or let them determine when or where you can carry your sword. And I just want to encourage you to never cower to a Philistine spirit and let someone take away your right to defend yourself. See, the Philistines had positioned the Israelites to accept defeat. Their game plan was to demoralize God's people so bad that there was no fight left in them, and so they would just give up and quit. But the reason for this chapter is to give you some inspiration to stand up and to speak up for what you believe in. And I just want to remind you, you are not crazy, my friend. The world is crazy. You have the mind of Christ, but the world has the mind of a Philistine. Don't ever forget that. The third thing I want to glean out of this text here is that the Philistine spirit wants to keep you broke. It says there in 1 Samuel chapter 13 that the price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening a plow point and a mattock, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and repointing goads. Now, it was kind of hard to find really accurate information about exchange rates from Hebrew shekels into today's currency. But the reason the price is mentioned is because the Philistines were charging an exorbitant price for a very simple service, about 10 times the going rate. As a matter of fact, if you look at that first sentence where it says a third of a shekel would come out to about $190 in current exchange rates. So when it says 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening a plow point, that comes out to about $380. The obvious implication there is that the Philistines made defending yourself so expensive, it was almost unaffordable to the common man. See, this is why politicians love the idea of rationing things like ammunition, because when you ration anything, whether it's ammunition or sugar, the price of something goes through the roof. And so politically, they cover themselves by giving you the right to bear an arm, but they make it so expensive to do that, it's basically impossible to stay well supplied. That, my friend, is a Philistine spirit. Number 4 is the Philistine spirit is always trying to cut the military. You know, I've followed the political scene my entire life, and every politician that starts preaching socialism, the obvious question they always have to answer at some point is, how are we going to pay for all these new programs that you are proposing to give us all for free? And basically they come up with the same answer almost every single time. The first answer they always come up with is cut the military. And in the course of my lifetime, I've seen several presidential candidates that promise free health care in college and, you know, yada, on and on and on. And it's always military cuts. It's a trick, don't buy it. A Philistine spirit will try to convince you that free cell phones and free internet is more important than protecting your national sovereignty or your personal property. But I want to go back, and there's many examples of this in world history. You know, one of the most obvious ones, Adolf Hitler, who gave Germany free everything and then confiscated their guns. And let's not forget China, Russia, Turkey, Cambodia, Guatemala, who all disarmed their country, and millions of people unable to defend themselves were exterminated. You see, anyone who makes a power play on your ability to defend yourself is operating under a Philistine spirit. And just to set the record straight, remember, it was not a group of peace activists that liberated Auschwitz. It was the American military. Number 5, the fifth thing I want to get out of this text is the Philistine spirit only allows the elite to defend themselves. If you go back to our text, it says, on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul or Jonathan had a sword or a spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. You see, under Philistine rule, only King Saul and his son Jonathan were granted the privilege of defending themselves with a sword and a spear. Everybody else had to reach for a cattle prod. You see, the Philistines that live among us today insist that only a trained professional should be able to own a defensive weapon. But do these people defend themselves with clubs? Oh, no. No, the Secret Service does not defend high-ranking politicians or high-ranking celebrities with a plow point or an axe. No, the elite get a taxpayer bodyguard and you get a slingshot. See, the hypocrisy of all this is astounding, but ladies and gentlemen, that's what it is to operate under a Philistine spirit. And even though our Constitution gives me the right to keep and to bear an arm, I still have to ask the government in most states for a permit to carry one legally. So how does a state get away with creating a law that violates the United States Constitution? Well, that's because we have not stood up to the Philistine spirit that has been attacking this nation for the last 50 years. And it's going to be a sad day when the United Nations declares that only the elite have the privilege of defending themselves, and they want the whole world to be a gun-free zone. Just remember, gun-free zones are a buffet for people who want to do the most amount of damage in the least amount of time with the least amount of risk to themselves. Never forget that. Number 6, the Philistine spirit wants to gain control of everything. How many of you ever heard of the story of Hitler's rise to power by a woman named Kitty Wetherman? She was born in Austria, and when she was 10 years old, Hitler came to power, and I want to just give you a few bullet points from her presentation. She said Hitler came to power in a political and economic vacuum, and Germany was in deep depression after their loss in World War I. And people were very nervous about the future, and Hitler claimed to have a plan to get Germany back on its feet economically. You know, who doesn't love a man with a plan, right? Well, when Hitler came to power, she walked into her classroom, and the crucifix that usually hung at the front of the room had been replaced with a picture of Hitler right next to the Nazi flag. Well, then Hitler gave everybody a national ID card, and you could not get on a bus or board a plane without it. And then Hitler was the first politician to use sound systems and give speeches on live radio, and he had very persuasive speeches that really played on people's frustrations about the government. And one of the things he did is he created a very us versus them mentality, dividing the rich from the poor. Well, then her teacher told the class, we won't be praying anymore. Instead, we will sing the German national anthem, translated Germany, Germany above all the world. And then Hitler instituted euthanasia for the mentally handicapped. And then he instituted a federal police force called the Gestapo, and they wore civilian clothes. You never knew who they were. And Hitler even created a network of informants, turning lifelong friends against each other. And if you refused to comply with the system, the people you loved just sort of disappeared. And then Hitler nationalized the banking system so all exchanges of currency could be traced by the government. And Hitler even took over the automobile industry and the educational system. And then he took over the churches. And he said those beautiful cathedrals need a lot of upkeep, and he says there's not enough private donations coming in, so he instituted a church tax, which was 2% of their income, and in so doing, Hitler controlled all the churches. And then obviously, last but not least, he instituted what was called national gun registration. This is where everybody brought in their guns to the police to have their gun registered so they knew who had a gun and who didn't. Well, when that didn't work, they confiscated all the guns in Germany, and refusing to comply was a capital punishment offense. This took Hitler only 5 years to do this, from 1938 to 1943, but looking back, she said if we would have kept our guns, we could have fought to keep our freedom. But instead, a total of 13 million Jews and others unable to defend themselves were rounded up and exterminated. And you know, Hitler never invaded Switzerland. It was the only country he never invaded, and here's why. In Switzerland, when a young man reached the age of 20, they were enrolled in a mandatory 3-month basic training course and were issued a uniform and an A31 straight pull rifle, at which point they were considered to be in active reserve. They also had to attend a mandatory 3-week refresher course every year until the age of 48, in which at that point they were considered retired or in active reserve. And in Switzerland, there was a law that you had to own a gun. And Switzerland was the only country Hitler never made a move on. Does the Bible have anything to say about defending yourself? Psalms 144:1, praise be to the Lord my God, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. Nehemiah chapter 4, then Sanballat, the Arabs and the Amorites heard that the repairs on the wall in Jerusalem were being done and the gaps were being closed, and they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against us and stir up trouble against us. But we prayed to our God, and we posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. You see the balance there between faith and action? We prayed to God and posted a guard day and night. And listen to this. You know, in Luke chapter 22, Jesus said to his apostles, he said, when I sent you out without a purse or a money bag or sandals? Did you lack anything? And they said, nothing. And the answer they said, but he said, now. He said, now, if you have a purse, a bag, take it with you. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Jesus knew that he was sending out his disciples into a hostile Roman Empire, and he gave them the mandate, protect yourselves. And never forget, ladies and gentlemen, the real reason that a Philistine spirit wants to disarm you is because all they want to hear from you is, yes, sir. The Second Amendment and the Philistine spirit.